Okay, so I do want to ask you a couple questions about just kind of problematizing our ideas about time, the nature of God's relationship to time, and just problematize this a little bit because you talk about this in your books. What was the name of your larger book that I recently read?
Well, I've written, yeah, The End of the Timeless God was the first book, and then the more recent one is From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker: Explorations in God's Temporality.
Okay,
So, like, really long, like, academic titles.
Gotcha. I've been through the first one and a few of your articles. I haven't made it through the second one quite yet, but I'll have to do that. But again, you talk about just our conceptions of time and some different views that are out there. And I think really up until I've started diving into this stuff in recent years, the only idea that I ever really have come across on the popular plane is, well, time is a fourth dimension and God is outside of it. He's created it all at once in this place called eternity that we can't really define. And so in that sense, God is timeless and outside of time. And the Bible talks about that because it uses words like eternity and eternal, which we'll talk about that as well. So I guess the first thing to ask is, does the Bible have a concept of eternity, eternal, this outside of time space?
It has a concept of eternity, but eternity, so the New Testament scholar G.E. Ladd, he says, biblically speaking, eternity just means a long time.
Right.
Because all of the words in Scripture for eternity are temporal words. And eternity historically has meant without beginning and without end, but then there's been an extra debate about, should I say more, that God's also timeless or God's temporal. So the Bible definitely has the concept of eternity without beginning, without end, and things being going on for like forever and ever and ever. But nothing to get timelessness. And we haven't defined that yet, but that's the answer, yeah, at the moment.
Yeah, I guess. And yeah, just to go over what you said there real quick is just like the Greek word that we come across several terms, but the most popular one is aionios, which it usually refers to like an age. And then in the Old Testament, Hebrew olam is a long duration of time and indefinite at times. So that's where you get that from beginning to end or of all ages kind of thing. So it does have this like indefinite past to indefinite future. But okay, set up the conversation a little bit to give us some definitions that we need about what is timelessness and eternity, and does the Bible communicate the idea of that outside of time concept, or is that kind of left open for interpretation or doing philosophy in that realm?
Mm-hmm. So let me state the completely like bare bones like question. The question really is,
yeah,
do you think God does one thing and then another and then another?
Mm.
Like that's it. It's like when we start talking about time, we're like, what about like Einstein and like all this like crazy like pop physics stuff? Like get rid of all that. Does God do one thing and then another and then another? That's it. We're like, well, yeah. I mean, I guess it says like, you know, He created the universe and then the next day He did this and then the next day He did. And I haven't even gotten out of chapter 1 and there's all this like and then. Well, that's temporality. That's divine temporality. Is God does one thing and then another. Timelessness says that's not possible. So timelessness says God exists without succession. God cannot do one thing and then another. And God has to exist without temporal location and without temporal relationship. So God does not exist right now. God exists. So, you know, like they're not atheists, but you know, like, but God does not exist right now. Whereas if you want to say God's temporal, you're like, yeah, God exists without beginning and without end. You know, He's eternal, but He's always existed. And He does one thing and then another because He has succession. And He exists right now. So, like, you know, if you want to, like, preach a sermon on Sunday, you could be like, I came to the most marvelous conclusion, everyone. God exists right now. You know, like, that just sounds, like, silly, but that's the implication of divine temporality, is God exists right now. He existed in the past.
We get back to
exists right now, and He will exist.
Yeah.
Well, then you unpack it for the relationality, yeah, but, like, just to completely mystify the whole thing, it's just,
yeah,
that's it. It's really basic.
No, that was good, because actually we had I don't know how we got off on this, but this conversation came up recently in our Sunday school class we just started discussing time. Is God inside, outside of time? How does this work? And again, I like that you backed up and said the real question is, does God do one thing after another and get away from, maybe starting out, get away from this whole idea of like different dimensions and all this, to just state it very simply. I really like how you put that, much better than I did when I was bringing this question up. And so what are some I guess, within the scholarly realm, popular, viable conceptions that are respected about how God relates to time.
Hmm. So the two main views are either timeless or temporal. I prefer to speak this way because it's more literal. When I say outside or inside, I'm smuggling in a spatial metaphor to talk about time. And after reading philosophy of time for about past 20 years, I eventually realized, oh my gosh, we do this all the time, and it's just confusing. It's just stop it. Like a lot of problems are introduced by this, by introducing spatial metaphors. But it's really difficult to avoid them. So I don't know how you, it just happens. So those are the most popular views. And so, like I said already, to be eternal is to exist without beginning and without end. But if you want God to be timeless, you have to say God also exists without succession and without temporal location and without temporal relationship. Whereas if you want God to be temporal, God exists without beginning and without end, but God can undergo succession. He can do one thing and then another.
So
Yeah, go ahead. What are you thinking?
you're saying he can be temporal without having a beginning and an end. Can you maybe
Yeah.
flesh that out?
Yes. So this is really good. So there's a traditional definition of what it means to begin to exist. So a thing begins to exist if it is preceded by non-existence. It's fancy words. Here's what that means. There wasn't anything, and then all of a sudden there it was. So I wasn't always here, and then now I'm here. So there was a moment when I was not. And so I began to exist. Because you can identify, like, Ryan's not there on the timeline. Oh, there he is. Okay. Like, that's it.
But there's
So,
some way in
what you'd
which
be-
God he can go through succession, but also there was no you can't go back far enough and find a time without him.
Correct. So there's at least two ways you could go. You could just have God have an infinite past. That's got to have some problems if you don't like infinite past stuff, which I don't personally. But I'm just letting you know what your options are. So
Gotcha.
you could have God with an infinite past. So for every moment you go back and back and back and back, God's always there. Another way to go is you say, well, there's a first moment to reality. Because a moment of time is the way things are, but could be subsequently otherwise. This is really technical. I don't know how to make this less technical. I'm sorry. So stick with me for a second. But that moment never began to exist because it's not preceded by non-existence. So there's God all alone without the universe. And that's the way things are. And they could be otherwise because God could freely do something at the next moment. But there's just God. And it's not preceded by non-existence. It's just God. And so that's as far back in reality as you can go. This is another option that you see with some people in the Middle Ages that are Kalam theologians within Islam. Richard Swinburne at Oxford seems like he's got a view similar to this. Dean Zimmerman at Rutgers, similar view to this. So these are some options you've got. Infinite past, or past is not infinite, but didn't begin to exist.
Yeah, some of these get complex. I got quite a ways into the Kalam cosmological argument. I think that was William Lane Craig, and gave me a headache after a while. I like biblical theology better than I do philosophy for sure.
Some of the stuff about infinity, there's a long history of people, philosophers and mathematicians, losing their minds while they're working on infinity. So it's a bizarre history of it, of just people just going nuts. So you want to learn infinity, but not too much, because you might
Not
go
too much
crazy.
about it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I want to, I'm sure, throw a wrench in this that I'm sure there's no answer for. And so, obviously, Einstein says that time is related to gravity and to mass, and so therefore it's part of creation, and so therefore time must be a created thing and God is outside of it, or maybe timeless, however you would say that. So, since it seems, unless something has changed in the physical model, which I probably wouldn't be abreast on, based on that modern conception, isn't time something that is created and therefore it is beneath God, not something that God operates within?
So let's ask a more fundamental question first before we get into this. So, because the working assumption here in these kind of questions and arguments is that if something is created, then God cannot have any of these properties associated with it. And you're like, okay, cool. So if something's created, God cannot be associated with it. He can't take on these properties. He can't take on a nature with these properties. Oh gosh, the incarnation is impossible. Right. So this is how it could go, because what you have in the incarnation is God becoming human. So just because God creates something does not mean that God's completely going to be radically disassociated from it. So this is something that's, I think, a unique claim about Christianity. It's like, no, God can enter into his creation in interesting ways. So just because God creates time doesn't mean God's going to be timeless. William Lane Craig is a great example of someone who thinks this, because Craig says God was timeless without the universe, but temporal with the universe. He thinks that when God creates, God enters into time in some kind of way that's a bit difficult to philosophically articulate, but that's the idea.
Gotcha.
So, the physics stuff, though. Yeah, so this is... Okay. When you're looking at the special theory of relativity, there's a bunch of ways you could mathematically, like, develop it, and one of them does tie space and time, like, very tightly together. And it doesn't have gravity, though, so that's bad. So that's why we know the special theory is false. It's not like a fundamental theory. And so we're like, okay, it's false. The general theory is supposed to give us gravity. We're like, okay, cool. That's nice. And it, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times the mathematics does tie these things together. All that would tell you, though, is that some sort of mathematical model where you can create a clock, that is what's created. It wouldn't necessarily tell you that time itself is created. Because what relativity is interested in is not time and space itself. It's interested in clocks and rods. It's interested in measurement systems. This is because it's built on certain philosophical theory called verificationism, which says that if you can't see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, hear it, then it doesn't exist. And so Einstein was like, time and space, I get rid of it. Clocks, rods. Like, that's what we want. And so it's built on this particular philosophy of science. So there's a lot of assumptions that are at play that we don't typically hear about in popular discourse. That is unfortunate because it makes it sound like we're talking about space and time, but really we're just talking about measuring devices.
Gotcha, yeah. That's something that I haven't really... I knew there was some kind of debate on the models there, but didn't know a whole lot really about. I haven't researched that. It's been outside of my scope, and so...
It's hard stuff. It's crazy stuff. Yeah.
And I think it's why it's easy to get discouraged with philosophy, because you have to know so much about a little bit of everything to engage in it. And so, I'm trying to even just grab onto some of the things that you're yeah, it's awesome getting to have this kind of conversation with someone who actually knows what they're talking about. It's something that I had thought of, and I don't know, I know you've raised this issue before when I've heard you on your podcast and in different writings, the issue of creation ex nihilo versus creation ex materia. That's something that we've talked about here before on the podcast, and something I'm working on kind of in the background. The way that I've wondered if time could relate to this conception, regardless of the different models. Now, what you said, maybe that's the end-all be-all answer, is they're not exactly, time and matter aren't exactly related, so it's kind of a moot point. But with creation ex materia versus creation ex nihilo, well, the Bible portrays waters as what was always there, what was there before creation began. And so is that literally scientifically the case? I think that's probably them using ancient Near Eastern conceptions to portray meaning about what God was doing at the beginning of creation, taking what was bad, what was tohu vavohu, what was desolate, and making it into good and overcoming it. Again, scientifically, what happened? I don't know. No idea. And so it's one of those things where we can conjecture about it, but the Bible, when it comes to things that are broad scope scientific realities, it may have those things incorrect, but it's using its own experience, the author's own experience, to portray meaning. And so just because maybe time works in a certain way, that doesn't mean we have to take that conception or function of time and press it on the Bible's conception of God. I think those can be helpful.
So something, when you read a lot of historical theologians and philosophers, one of the things you'll notice is some of them will try to really be up to date with the physics of their time. And so Gersonides is this Jewish philosopher from the Middle Ages I quite like, and he affirms like creation out of pre-existent matter. And he's got this view of like the cosmos where like there's only 9 planets, and the universe just kind of ends shortly after that. There's no more the rest of the galaxy after that. And he's like, well, why? Because we can't really see much after that. And so just he's working with like what's like a lot of really cutting edge like cosmology and physics at the time. And then it turns out like, okay, a lot of that's false. And you're like, oh gosh. And so when we're doing it today, like we've got to be careful about this. Especially when
all on its head.
Exactly, especially when we know that the general theory of relativity is false because it conflicts with quantum mechanics. And we know that quantum mechanics as we have it right now is false because it conflicts with like lots of other things that are confirmed in the general theory. And so we're like, we don't know what the fundamental story of physics is. That doesn't mean you stop trying to do physics, and it doesn't mean you stop trying to say things that are consistent with science, but it's just a cautionary tale of how closely do I want to wed what I think are core theological ideas to science. because
Right.
I'll look like an idiot when people are reading my books like 50 years from now.
Exactly, yeah. And I think most people understand that, but there's also, I come across that a lot where like, well, time and matter are related, so therefore it must be this way. God must be timeless because time's a created thing. It's like, well, the Bible at least, regardless of its, philosophical cosmological view, sees God as doing one thing after another, sees God as relating to his people. And so I think regardless of what the reality of time may be and the reality of God's relationship to it, we need to take that at face value, because what the biblical author intends for us to understand is that God relates to and interacts with his people.
Yes, because when you're looking at the Genesis narrative, there's a lot of stuff going on there, but like one of the important themes is God's creating these spaces and then filling them. And some people want to say like it's kind of setting up like a cosmic temple and then putting priests in there. And I'm like, sounds good to me. I don't know. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. I'm just going to copy your homework. So I think it seems plausible to me. And so a lot of the way the themes are developed, I'm like, okay, this sounds right to me. So God's creating, but what you get in terms of like the rest of your theology, the bare bone claim is something like God's creating an orderly universe for some sort of reason, and humanity has a important role to play in that. Do I have all the details where I could sit down and write like a scientific textbook on it? No, of course not. But that's fine. I've got the big ideas that are important for orienting my life and orienting how I want to think about reality. Now, the question of creation out of nothing or creation out of matter, there's one verse that I don't see come up enough in these conversations, which is Psalm 90, which describes God as from everlasting to everlasting you are God. Before the heavens and the earth were formed, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. I'm like, what's before all this stuff? So Genesis, like, yeah, you're right. It's got the ambiguity there, right? This looks like hovering over this. The what now? He's hovering over something. This doesn't sound like it's out of nothing. Whereas the Psalm 90 verse sounds more like it out of nothing. And then when I'm looking at Ephesians or some of these other texts where it talks about God before the world, in the age before the world, God's plotting and planning to take over the world before he creates it. And I'm like, okay, this sounds like it's out of nothing. But it could still be consistent with something like prime matter. But I don't understand prime matter. So let me say something about this and then get your reaction to this. So Gersonides is one of these people in the Middle Ages who says like God creates out of prime matter. So before the universe exists, there's God and this material stuff. And then God creates the universe out of material stuff. Like, okay, well tell me about this material stuff. And Gersonides is like, I gotcha, don't worry. So there's material stuff. It doesn't have any mass. It doesn't take up any like spatial location. It doesn't actually exist at any moment of time. So it exists nowhere and exists no when. And it doesn't even have any properties. But it's matter, trust me. And I'm like,
Right. Okay.
I don't think I can trust you on this. But this is a very common view in the Middle Ages about prime matter. And so there's a common complaint against it is it sounds like nothing, or it sounds like the classical view of God. So what's going on?
Yeah. Right. So most of my scope ends after about 200, 250 AD. And so a lot of those, like I've come across those arguments and I just, again, outside of scope, not really touching them a whole lot.
Yeah.
My thrust more so is that the biblical conception, and again, there's all sorts of, like you mentioned, a few verses there that have to be addressed. But the biblical conception seems to be in line with the ancient Near Eastern conception that there is nothing but waters, and in some places and in the Bible there is land that is there.
Yes.
That is tohu vavohu, desolate. And so what God is doing, and in every ancient Near Eastern creation story, there's a problem there. The deity does not have a dwelling and everything is desolate. That problem needs to be solved. Mm-hmm. How does he do that? Well, you get some different solutions as far as like the purpose of those solutions in different stories. But in the Bible, it's, well, I'm going to create a society. That is the ultimate, that's what creation is. And, you can look at Richard Clifford. He looks at the ancient Near East and shows how pretty much the goal of every creation story is society. In some places, it's just to prop up the gods and fill their needs. In the Bible, that society is supposed to be God's vice regents. They're governors over what he has turned from bad into good. And so it takes, you get away from, as you get into theology, this idea of God didn't have to create, but actually there was a problem to solve. Which again, just why is there evil here? Well, the problem is still being solved, and so you undercut a lot of these problems. I think it's beneficial and worth talking about. At least that's my take on it. And so those are kind of the things that I'm kind of driving at and hitting on. And what was before? Well, scientifically, I don't know. I don't care. What I care about is the biblical conception and what the meaning behind it is. And so those kinds of prime matter questions, very interesting. You would know a lot more than I would.
I mean, I know a few things, but it's a book I'm writing right now is Models of God and Problems of Creation, where I'm trying to look at a lot of these different views and figure out
Mm.
arguments for and against each one. I pointed out something that's very important to emphasize, which is when you're looking at these theories, you're trying to figure out why would God create anything, and then it has a lot of knock-on effects for other questions that pop up in your theology, like the problem of evil. Why is there evil in the world? Why exactly is the universe structured the way it is? Like, what's going on here? Was this really a wise and loving thing to do? Like, God, what are you doing? The
Right.
answers you give earlier, they're going to inform the answers you give to people here and now.
Absolutely. And if God is unchanging and static, and there was nothing beforehand, and there was no necessity for the way things are now, honestly, in the past, come to a place of like, I don't understand any of this. Nothing of it makes sense to me, but God, I just trust you because you were willing to come and die for me. So this must be a good plan, but I don't understand a lick of it. In a different conception, I feel a little more like, I get this. This makes sense. I understand why creation can be this way, and God is still all-knowing and loving.
Yeah, because I think the trust is the biggest question here, right? Because I mean that's what faith is this trust
Right.
in the promises of God, and so you're doing the best you can to figure out what exactly God is like, what exactly His promises are. Is He the sort of being that will keep His promises? Is He the sort of being that could actually keep His promises? And you try to figure out the best you can. Are you going to figure it all out? No, of course not. You can't figure out most things entirely. Like that's just ridiculous. But we're in the same boat when it comes to God. It's like we're not going to figure this all out, but we need to know enough to figure out: can I trust this being with my salvation, with all the things He said He's going to do?
Absolutely. Well, Ryan, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us. There are so many more places I want to take this conversation and other things I'd love to ask you. But I think this was, again, just really good as we've kind of problematized divine impassibility and kind of given a more biblical view of what's going on here, just trusting the text with what it says. And also, with time at least, we problematize that for, I think, a lot of people. We're used to just one particular conception. And so knowing there's some other actual viable options out there and maybe some that are more biblical, I think that'll be different and hopefully helpful, especially when it comes to, again, God does relate to his people. So, Ryan, thank you for coming on and lending your wisdom to our listeners.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, Ryan, thank you so much. My brain hurts in a good way, but it's been fun. I really enjoyed it.
Good.